Hi all. A little video to talk about one of the common problems in a good essay from last time. So yesterday I showed you a video on the author's voice, and a lot of you are not catching the argument, and some of you are not catching where the author is distinguishing their argument, his or her own argument, from other people's arguments. So it's really important to see what they're saying as opposed to what they say other people are saying. That's just that's a basic feature of any social science humanities piece. You look at the literature and you say, Bob said this, Betty said that, John said that, I'm saying this. So it's to differentiate yourself from what's already been said. So you're not just saying the same damn thing over again, right? But a couple of you did some really quite good essays that still didn't quite get the mark. So that's what today's video is about. These essays were both in the kind of B plus A minus range. They both had very real strengths. I think both of these authors demonstrated very clearly that they understood the articles, but they did so in different ways and in ways that illustrate two common problems. I'm going to call this the forest and the trees problem. One of these essays is good at looking at the trees, but not very good at looking at that big picture. The other one's pretty good at looking at the big picture, but not very good at looking at the trees. And of course, what you want to do is find some balance there. If you don't know that expression, the forest for the trees, it's, sometimes you see the forest, but you miss all the detail on the ground that makes up the forest. And other times you're looking at a tree, but you don't actually understand the forest around that. So that's the kind of analogy that I'm running with here. So two students, call them students, and by the way, these are your classmates. This is from fall 2020. This is two of your classmates who volunteered to do this. I saw these two essays that kind of did two different things, both of them good, and I thought they'd be nice illustrations of this problem. So student A, thank you very much, student A, looked at Kretsch. Nice opening sentence, a little bit long and a little bit confusing, just a tiny bit, but still getting at general points. Kretsch examines conservation ideals and argues that fur trades between indigenous peoples and European settlers could be defined by hunting standards and wildlife preservation. Specifically, and that's kind of a nice transition. I'm not sure why the semicolon, but a tiny detail. Specifically, Kretsch characterizes the fur trade as dependent on the production of beaver skins and claims that excessive European avidity, nice word, held agency over fur trades in terms of supply and demand. Now, I like this because it's getting directly at some of the issues here, but it's also a little vague on kind of the general point that Kretsch is getting at. Kretsch is getting at conservation, and our author here does mention this, but doesn't highlight it in a way that would be nice and direct and succinct and immediate for us to see that. Then the author goes on to talk about specific things, a defining characteristic of European fashion, mass killings of beaver needed to meet supply and demand. Indigenous groups involved in beaver hunting were responsible for the endangerment of beavers, a crucial piece of the article. And this author takes us through a series of other details. Kretsch explains that indigenous peoples engaged in these hunting practices for trade goods, and trade was often a means of survival. Other significant details through here. I just want to point out something really quickly here, though. There's nice details in this, but two things. One, it's a bit long. Remember, this is the 500-page essay, and this chunk right here is, well, look at that. It's 253 words. So you're already at half of what you're allowed, and you have no introduction and no conclusion. So a little bit of a problem there. But this is the one looking at the trees and not looking at the forest. We don't really get a clear general sense, a direct and immediate general sense of what the author is arguing. So like it for its detail, well-written, nuanced, subtle, clearly understands what's going on, but not so clear on directly telling us the main point of all this. Student B, this is the one looking at the forest well, does it differently. Shepard Kretsch's argument in Beaver is that the natural environment paid the price for the desire of both Europeans and indigenous peoples to profit off its resources through participation in the fur trade. I think that's a tiny bit wordy, but it gets directly at the issue of environmental depredations and lack of conservation. I think it could have been said more directly and more immediately, but still, it's fine. Kretsch proposes that both sides contributed to the near extinction of the beaver population, but had differing views on how to manage it sustainably in the future. European officials attempted to manipulate indigenous groups' hunting territories in order to better control trapping practices, while some trappers refused to increase the supply of furs even in response to higher prices. That's really good. But gosh, I would have loved to have seen an illustration of that. I would love to have seen some direct evidence. Kretsch gives a fair bit of direct evidence in this piece, and you could have used some of that there to kind of illustrate that in some kind of sense, that some sort of immediate sense, much as author A had done, to give us a little more concrete, a little more specific, a little more tangible sense of what's going on there. So this is good, and nice general overview piece of what's happening in the piece. Notice something here though. This piece is, so it's a tiny bit general, could have been more specific, but it's much shorter. This one's 144 words. And remember, in this chapter, there was 2 pieces, one by Bruce White, one by Shepard Kretsch. So what this author has done for herself, what our classmate here, what they have done here is to give themselves a bit of room. And so I'll just put it way down at the bottom here. Look, suddenly what we have here, we have a lot of room for conclusion. Common theme, trying to bring the 2 pieces in conversation. Exhibited through these 2 articles is that the fur trade cannot be viewed as one independent and consistent entity. The authors both discuss how relationships and patterns of trade varied from group to group, region to region. So nice general overview here in the final paragraph that makes some comparing points between the 2 pieces. Remember author A, who wrote a bit too much, a bit too long, a bit too detailed? That person was squeezed for something to say at the end. There was no real introduction to the essay, and as a conclusion, it is actually tacked on to the end of a paragraph. It doesn't hang alone as a paragraph as I've done it here. But in terms of a general wrap-up, this is all. It is beneficial to read the Kretsch and White articles together as they provide complementary perspectives on the fur trade. So great, that's good to know. But it would be nice to flesh that out and show some of those complementary perspectives, illustrate them, compare them, give us an immediate and direct comparison of the 2 pieces. That would have been enormously helpful. The other thing I want to point out here is that for all these essay strengths, and again, I can't stress enough, I think these 2 authors understood these pieces. I think these 2 authors are clearly capable of writing an A essay. Well, one of them did write an A- essay, but kind of barely. They were a point or 2 apart, really. But they're really very much in the same ballpark. But I think both of them could have been writing clear A essays, but they didn't. The other thing that they didn't do was offer a general question. And, actually, if you look at that chapter, if you look at it's chapter 1 in our textbook, the editor of that chapter, Colin Coates, actually gives you a question. Why did Indigenous people participate in the fur trade? It's right there. It's in the chapter of the title. There's other ways to pose that question, but it was right there. It was right there in the chapter. So kind of an obvious missing link here. Had these 2 people gone to that question, I think they could have channeled the information they were using more effectively, told the story more clearly, because you would see that kind of guiding question throughout the whole thing. That would have been a really, really helpful step there. Anyhow, can't stress enough. Good, solid papers. I was really pleased with them. Not in my group. They're in a different group. I was looking at some of the TA papers, but I think I happened to read these 2 back to back, and I went, oh, that's interesting. They kind of did it in opposite ways. But again, did it well. So I was pleased just to see that it was done well. These are dense readings. Particularly the Bruce White one, I think is a very subtle reading. But still, these 2 authors handled it with aplomb. But again, when you're writing in this final paper, it's a longer paper, so you have a little bit more room. So the space issue isn't as important. But you still want to be succinct. You still want to be direct. You still want to be clear in suggesting that you understand what each piece is about. And you also want to be showing that forest view. You also want to be showing the connections, making some comparisons, showing, as I've been stressing, there's a conversation underway here. And both Kretsch and White, to go to that question, both of them talk about why Indigenous people participated in the fur trade. They arrive at slightly different answers. I don't think they're in gross debate with one another. They don't fundamentally disagree with one another, but they see things differently. But they're both interested in the question of agency, and they're both interested in the question of why Indigenous peoples hunted in the way that they hunted, why they traded in the way that they traded. And so they're fundamental, simple, but fundamental questions. And tackling that question directly can be a very effective way to get yourself through that second assignment. So yesterday's video was about getting at the argument, getting at the author's voice. Today it's about how to shape it, how to craft it, how to bring detail into it, how to hang it around a general question. Think about those general questions, those general issues, and I think if you do that in a kind of in an outline fashion, I think you'll do better essays the second time around. Look forward to reading them. You take care. We'll talk soon.